take a moment to thank you for registering for the webinar and giving up your valuable time. I know it's not easy these days. Really appreciate you guys coming online and engaging with us in this way. So in the first one, we kind of just scratched the surface a little, talking briefly around fitness, nutrition, clothing and gear. In the last one, we talked about building the engine for the ultra runner, and in this session we're going to be discussing the fueling needs for the ultra runner. With regards to the sort of physiological demands of competitive ultramarathon training and event participation, an optimal nutritional intake is essential for optimal sporting performance. This applies during running, in the preparation and recovery periods, pre and post as well. So it's quite a vital component of ultra running, really. And also the potential health implications and complications around doing such extreme endurance exercises and events. You know, we need to be very mindful about our nutrition. And so the aims of this webinar really are to explore the physiological and nutritional demands of ultra running, provide general guidance on ultra running nutritional requirements for training periodization and respective to ultramarathon running, and also provide general guidance on race nutrition and logistics, including the prevention and management of running associated gastrointestinal issues. So quite a lot to get through. We've only got a short time, so we're going to have to really whiz through these quite quickly. So before we get into this, the usual housekeeping. It's a relatively short webinar. As I said, we're going to do maybe 20-25 minutes of the presentation and then a bit of Q&A at the end. Try to find a quiet place if you can, where your distractions are limited. Make notes as we go along. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We will pick them up at the end if we can. I believe this is being recorded, so it will be available on the Athletics Hub post session at some point in the coming days. So don't panic if you've missed anything. You can always rewatch it at the end. So let's get into the nitty-gritty, really. So nutrition and hydration is often discussed in a sometimes controversial subject amongst the ultra running community. So in this presentation, we're going to briefly cover the following subjects. Now, bear in mind, this is a very complex and technical subject, and we only have a 30-minute window to get through this. So we will be skipping through the subjects very rapidly and not as deep as we would like. So you may elicit some questions. You can always email them to me afterwards. So really, the kind of things we're going to cover off today is the physiological demands of ultra running, nutritional demands, fat adaptation protocols, race nutrition, gastrointestinal disturbances and symptoms, some we've already heard about many times, I'm sure, in the past, hydration, and then just sort of finish off with some typical kind of take-home messages for you guys and girls out there. So let me just flip onto the next slide. So let's get into this. Bear with me a second. So there are numerous factors that determine the success or otherwise of your ultra running race. So your aerobic capacity, the engine. Has your training been sufficient for the task at hand? So, you know, if you're doing a 100-mile or 100K race, you know, has your training been sufficient for that? If it's a multi-day event, you know, has your training been sufficient for that? Because the trainings across all those spectrums between a 50K and a multi-day event are hugely different. So that's quite important. Your lactate response. So did your training enable you to better buffer the lactate? So although a lot of ultra running tends to be at a steady pace, there will be times where your effort levels will shoot up, you know, maybe around the terrain that you're running on and stuff like that. Economy of movement. So this is included in your overall running economy, and it's not just how efficiently you can supply the much needed oxygen to your muscles, but it's also about reducing unrequired movement patterns or keeping them to the bare minimum, really. Your skill at running the demands of the course. You know, are you a good climber? What about descent? Can you go down well? Are you running on trails? You know, are you good at all these things? These have a big impact on your ability to perform well. Pacing, specifically pacing strategies. You know, can you be consistent throughout the race for the distance and the time? You know, again, you're running on economy, your skill, your ability to adjust your running technique to suit the terrain. So the ground contact time, aerial time, step frequency, running velocities, all of these kind of funky metrics that will be affecting your overall performance on the race day. It's also important to note that individual variables such as oxygen kinetics, power application, and sustainability variables often have a huge effect in your performance outcomes. So, you know, running these kind of pacing in these races, it's a multifaceted input into you and how you can actually pace those. So you need to bear that in mind with the training. The thermoregulation, so here we're talking about how you handle the heat and your body. It's an important aspect of ultra running, especially if events are taken in hot and humid conditions, and often a lot of them are. So the increased production of internal body heat during prolonged strenuous running and external heat stress from the environment can challenge the thermoregulation mechanisms in your body. So we'll often see that if your race say is excess of 30 degrees and say only 20% of humidity, so it's not a huge amount of humidity compared to say more temperate ambient conditions, you will really struggle and you'll see a dip in your performance around that. So these are things that you have to bear that in mind. So success in ultramarathon running events conducted in hot and ambient conditions, irrespective of the humidity, requires an ability to maintain a homeostatic core body temperature. So that's one of the things you have to bear in mind, obviously, and these things obviously you can add into your training as well to handle that. And I think one of the things that's often overlooked as well is the managing of things like heat stroke and some of the symptoms around that. That so you will get gastrointestinal and immune responses to those kind of issues, and then during and in a lead up to and during and post race, that you may get some clinical or subclinical issues, related to your heat. I mean, I've had it before, and I'm just doing just a marathon, I've had heat exhaustion afterwards. So these things that you have to bear in mind. Gastrointestinal regulation. Can your stomach handle the nutrition you supply? You need to ensure that's part of your preparation for your race, part of the training, that you practice this, and also practice this in your recovery periods, because sometimes after the event you can still have a lot of intestinal disturbances. So these are the things we think about. And health management, so when I'm talking about this, I'm referring to your sort of overall health and well-being. So your injuries that you get, your illnesses, infections, signs and symptoms, these are all part of the demands of ultra running. And one that's overlooked is the mental attitude. So the motivation, your drive, your toughness, your cognitive functions such as decision making under stress and fatigue. These are all important factors that will have an impact on your overall ability to perform. And there you'll see a nice little sort of picturesque view or pictorial view of what I'm talking about there, and you can kind of see the various things that feed into your ability to succeed in an ultra marathon race. So let's move on to the nutritional demands and support strategies. So I guess one of the key things there is, the first bullet point there, is that there is really insufficient studies at this moment. It's all lab-based kind of stuff, and a lot of it's done around sort of cycling and other sports. There's very few studies that are actually done into specific relating to ultra runners and that kind of stuff. So we have to bear that in mind when we look at these kind of stuff. So data has shown, though, that caloric expenditure of between 3,800 to nearly 5,000 calories per day, just when you're running a 5-day undulating multi-stage ultramarathon in hot and ambient conditions, and that can change to 4,700 stroke 5,600 plus for an 8-day mountain-based multi-stage marathon conducted in a sort of cold to temperate conditions. 6,000 to 8,000 calories per day if you've got a 250 kilometer 5 days multi-stage ultra marathon, and up to, and this is quite extreme, but it will get up to those kind of levels of nearly 18,000 calories per day for a 24-hour single stage trail ultra marathon. And the data suggests that single-stage ultramarathon events may result in a vast energy expenditure. However, it's relatively low continuous hourly rate of around about 550 calories per hour over that whole 24-hour period. So the total energy cost is dependent upon the specific race and distance duration, really. Considering the typical longer non-stop distance of single stage ultramarathon events compared with each individual stage of multi-stage ultramarathon events and subsequent non-exercising rest periods between stages, it's likely to be more difficult for ultramarathon runners to match the energy expenditure with the energy intake needs during the single stage ultramarathon competitions, resulting in a reasonable substantial acute energy deficit. So meeting the energy demands the subsequent macronutrient profile and micronutrient provisions for general ultramarathon running and training and multi-stage ultramarathon events appears to be manageable with appropriate planning. And that's the key thing, it is planning. And the general guidance around this for the moment, for consecutive days of prolonged endurance training, so when you're doing that multi-day thing, achieving the energy balance is recommended alongside the provision of sufficient carbohydrate to meet exercise load and demands. So we're talking around about 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight for each day that you're kind of going along there, and consumption of sufficient protein as well to meet the daily nitrogen balance, so 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day to support the sort of tissue recovery and adaptations as well. So that's a little key point to note there. Again, we're talking about the recovery, you'll have that ongoing during your race. So habitual dietary protein needs for elite endurance athletes are estimated to between 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilogram, and it's likely to be similar with ultramarathon runners, given that similar training volumes they take. So obviously when we're talking about elite endurance runners, we're talking probably marathoners here, and we're saying that ultramarathoners, it will be a very similar kind of requirement and need. And I think that's one of the things that you also have to consider, that you need to take on some dietary protein during the single stage ultramarathon running events, but it's going to be unlikely to be possible for most runners, especially if unsupported. For example, an elite 100-mile ultramarathoner runner will consume very little protein before or during competition. However, 1.3 to 2.2 grams per kilogram for a day or so per day of protein has been observed in successful semi-supported and self-sufficient multi-stage ultramarathon finishers. So again, we're talking about getting that protein in there. For those athletes there, it's difficult for them to get it in during the actual race, but afterwards they'll be sort of loading up to recover and aid that recovery of the muscles. Now, if we want to reduce the energy deficiency gap, there's a potential risk of developing exercise-associated gastrointestinal symptoms due to compromised gastrointestinal function. So that sort of delayed gastric emptying, the intestinal transits, and all the impaired digestion and the associated absorption or lack thereof that happens during that. And we often see a fair bit of gastrointestinal stress from there. It appears that training status may influence food and fluid intake tolerance during the running, so bear this in mind. So what we're saying here is that you can potentially train this. So if you look at a highly trained runner compared to, say, your average ultramarathon runner, the highly trained runners will take in a similar amount of calories perhaps, but they won't seem to suffer with that same level of gastrointestinal disturbance that the less trained athlete will do. So it's therefore probably likely that we're seeing some sort of development in around their training of the gut to meet those kind of demands. So that's something you need to bear in mind. Another kind of key thing really is meeting the energy demands and the subsequent macronutrient profile and micronutrient provisions. For general ultramarathon running and training, the multi-stage ultramarathon events appear to be manageable with appropriate planning. And again, planning is the key thing. As per the general sort of endurance exercise and consensus guidelines for consecutive days of prolonged endurance training, achieving an energy balance of let's have a look. An energy balance is recommended alongside the provision of sufficient carbohydrate to meet exercise load demands. So again, we're looking at around about 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day in that kind of running load there. And if we don't get that, then you're potentially going to get depleted in that as you run along. And also, again, we're talking about the protein requirements, and again, we're looking at 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight to support the tissue recovery and adaptation. Habitual dietary protein needs for elite endurance athletes estimated to be, again, 1.6 to 1.8 per day, and it's going to be very similar in your ultra runners. That's what we're kind of saying in that. So, although the nutritional intake to meet the demands of the shorter endurance running events seem feasible, we have to consider that there are going to be some differences in that. So I guess, especially when during the competition phase. So if we look how that works, so the excessive transient or long-term low-grade energy and nutritional deficits justify considering ultramarathon runners as a high-risk population for development of the relative energy deficiency syndrome, or REDS as it's often referred to, or the female triad for the women out there. And also unexplained underperformance or overtraining syndrome, and exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome, and soft tissue injuries, illnesses, infections, and associated acute chronic health implications. So again, the nutritional intake does have a bearing on some of those outcomes there, really. And so, considering nutritional recommendations for general endurance exercise are predominantly derived from controlled laboratory settings, generally among highly trained individuals of different modalities, such as cycling. Seems to be there's a plethora of studies on cycling, but very little on ultra running out there. And distances are, again, shorter than the typical ultra run out there. It's plausible that these current recommendations may need adjusting to cater for specific populations, demographics, real life practical barriers such as race characteristics. You know, you might struggle to get some nutrition on that, depending on the race in front of you that you're doing. I think really further research is definitely warranted in this kind of area, and hopefully we're going to see more and more of that coming over the next few months and years ahead. So flipping on to fat adaptation protocols, and this is often a controversial subject for a lot of people. So again, in recent years, there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence from sports nutrition professionals suggesting a growing number of elite and amateur ultramarathon runners are purposely attempting, with or without professional guidance, to adhere to a low-carb, high-fat or ketogenic diet, aiming to enhance the maximal and relative fat oxidation capacity during moderate to vigorous running speeds, and subsequently to enhance their ultramarathon running performance. And lots of debate around that. The growing dietary trend amongst ultramarathon runners tends to be based upon sort of scarce research and supporting evidence around this. Fat is a favourable fuel substrate during low to moderate intensity, and I guess a lot of the ultra runs are ran at that kind of low to moderate intensity. So there's definitely a lot to be said around having a look at that. But what we also do see is that when an athlete is carbohydrate depleted, that they do struggle with performance, and we tend to the human body tends to prefer, even through training, it tends to prefer to have carbohydrate as a source of energy throughout that. However, theoretically, ultramarathon runners with a high fat oxidative rate, so they've done that training, then they should be able to sustain around about 700 calories of an hour of energy from your fat. So that could be beneficial in running if the duration is sort of prolonged, so 10 hours plus, and it's of a sort of low intensity, so maybe 5 or 6 kilometers an hour, or equivalent up to around about 45% of your VO2 max, up to moderate kind of intensities, maybe to 55-60% of your VO2 max. You'll certainly see a benefit in that kind of stuff. So that's something to bear in mind. I think from an ultramarathon perspective, higher exercise intensities, so above 70% of your VO2 max, can intermittently occur during undulation or extreme course conditions. So maybe you're climbing a lot of hills, and you're soon finding your VO2 max is you're pushing into that sort of threshold area, and that's really where if you have not got any carbohydrates in you, you are really going to start to feel that, because your fat cannot really supply that kind of energy for that kind of effort. So you really will struggle with that. But again, it's open for debate right now because there's no real clear studies on being done into this right now that from a scientific basis to prove evidence either way. So it's certainly something we should consider. And what I always say to most people is that your training should involve a fair degree of low fat, low carb, high fat diet training, and then on race day, you want, and hopefully you've prepped this during your training as well. You're used to taking on some carbohydrates so you can really boost the system up. So when you've run out of carbohydrates, you're not really struggling too much because you can, you've trained your body to utilize its fat stores there. So that's what we're really talking around there. Now, determining whole body fuel utilization during ultramarathon events presents challenges and complexities, which will impact on the magnitude of exercise stress and subsequently dictate fuel kinetics. And I guess what we're saying here really is there's a lot playing around in your fueling and will have a definite effect on your performance on race day. So if you haven't trained your body to perform well under fat burning areas, and you run out of carbohydrates, you're going to find that very challenging. And also, conversely, if you haven't also trained your body to use some carbohydrates during your actual training phases, that you'll find it very difficult for your body to absorb those over a long period of time, and you'll probably get more gastrointestinal issues around that. So here we've got a nice little sort of a typical kind of table around sort of race nutrition that you might see you might see a lot of runners using, and again, there's a wide variation of ultra marathon events. So the logistics of race nutrition and management vary dramatically based upon the event. Some events, the supplies are needed, and you can easily bring them in a handheld water bottle, a soft flask, maybe a small Camelback or something like that to supply it for yourself. Others, you're going to have bigger bags because it's a multi-stage event, or maybe the demands that you need to pack some clothing and stuff like that. And others, you're going to have to carry some mandatory gear, food, all of this kind of stuff as part of the requirements. And others may have aid stations in and stuff like that. So there's lots of variation in your opportunities to get fuel on board, I guess, during that race, and you have to plan that when you're doing your training as well. I think some of the general factors appropriate for all events can be considered. So the energy intake is ranging from between 36 to 63% of your energy expenditure. So that's what you would typically see in a single stage ultramarathon lasting anything from 24 to 30 hours. And you'd be looking at a relative energy deficit of around about 1,000 calories per day. Say for most people, that's what they'll be looking at. So you're not really likely to ever fully break even on the number of calories that you take in. And to avoid carrying excessive amounts of nutritional items during the event, and therefore unnecessary weight in your bags, in your packs, ultramarathon runners should also determine in advance what nutritional items will be available in the event, so they can access them whilst they're racing. And also, they should also plan that in their training as well. So those ultra runners competing abroad, it's important to determine also whether certain foods are available in that race country, since some of the choices may vary wildly. So, if you've spent a lot of time training on a particular fuel, a brand of pork pie, for argument's sake, and then you go to a different country and you cannot get that, that's going to have a big impact on you there. Also, you need to be quite flexible with your nutritional items consumed, because you are going to get some cravings, and you probably want to eat what's most tolerable because you're going to be out there for a long time. So just saying I'm going to only have carbohydrates or only going to have this during a long ultra race, it's going to be quite a challenge. So definitely want variety in your fuel. And I guess also you need to consider that if your nutrients are going to be largely or exclusively consumed in a liquid form, you should consider sort of hyperhydration and associated health complications around, such as hyponatremia. So you need to factor that into it as well. So if you are taking all of your stuff on as fluid, which may be easier to ingest and keep down, if you're taking excess water as well, you've got that to consider of as well. So that's something you need to factor in and bear that in mind. We are rushing out of time rapidly, and I've still got so many slides to go through here. Let me just scoot through some stuff here. So again, this is just a quick, we've been on that one already. So let me have a look where we're at. So I'm just going to shoot ahead slightly because I'm running rapidly out of test. So we're going to talk about gastrointestinal disturbances and symptoms. I'm rushing really fast. So these are rapidly, okay, 2 seconds, Spencer, just give me time to finish this quick phrase here. So this is something that 60 to 96% of runners in a recent study reported experiencing. So this is something we need to factor into that. And again, we'll talk about that. I guess what I will try and do is I will try and get a list of people that have registered, if that's possible, from Spencer, and maybe ping out these slides separately. And yes, Steve wants some more question time. So we've kind of cut it short because I've still got another 3 or 4 slides to get through. But yes, so it's possible to read the slides. So what we'll do is I'll get these slides sent out to all of the attendees. And then what we'll do is you can also then email different questions through to me and so on and so forth. But let's go through some Q&As right now, Spencer. What have we got? Okay, so one from Jane. How would you go about beginning ultra training if you're a seasoned road marathoner who has done runnable trail before and cross-country races already? Well, again, I would probably look for something on the shorter distance. I mean, if you're a seasoned marathoner, you know, you're obviously going to be used to fueling yourself, and you're going to be used to the mileage that it takes in the training. And you've already done some trail and cross country before. So really it'd be a case of, if that was me, I'd be saying to you as a coach, so what's your preferred kind of distance? What we're going to work towards, start on a shorter scale, maybe a 50K or something like that, or a 40 miler. And, you know, do you want to be a trail runner? Do you want to be a road runner on there, or anything in between? So it's really about, I guess, starting on the shorter distances first, building up and working onto your preferred kind of course, I suppose. That's how I would look at that one. So next question, Spencer. Again from Jane, can we also share the slides? So yes, yeah, absolutely, yes. As we've just said before, we will definitely get a list of everybody who's registered, and I will get those slides out to you, and then feel free to email questions back to me afterwards. How good is racing at heart rate as a strategy for ultra racing? Yeah, you know, that is a great question. So I guess it depends on the individual athlete. I mean, there are some things that are going to affect your heart rate massively, you know. So if it's very, very hot, that's going to you're going to raise your heart rate up, because of course you're going to get a bit of a thickening of your blood there due to the sort of plasma conditions and stuff like that. So that's going to raise your heart rate up. So you definitely slow you down for that. And also, if the terrain is very lumpy, you may get some very irregular stats on your heart rate there. But definitely, you know, it would work. I think it depends on how fit you are and how used you are to using your heart rates within racing conditions. Because of course, if you're truly racing and not just going to complete the event, then you're going to be wanting to probably have your heart rate up at a certain level. You know, so you're looking at that sort of 70% kind of level, and you know, having that alert you, I guess, when you dip below it or when you go too high as well. Next question then. So Neil, is it possible to bank hydration, carbs, protein in training weeks leading to the event and basically keep topping up as you go through the event, so not having to feel as eating as much? So I'm presuming you're talking about sort of like loading your carb loading phase pre-race. Well, of course you will carb load pre-race and hydrate pre-race. So in that sense, yes, you definitely are banking some of that. And of course, when you get to that sort of taper phase, your reduced volume in training will probably mean that you're actually automatically banking and storing more carbohydrate into your muscles and your liver, etc. And of course, if you keep top side of your hydration, that's quite important. But you can't do it for weeks and weeks and weeks, because there's only so much you can store in realms of carbohydrates. So you will need to top up on the race day. And typically, I think of it as, imagine this glass here. I start up here towards the end of the race. As long as I'm not completely empty, if I'm here, I'm okay with that, as long as I'm not empty. So that's what we're really trying to achieve on that kind of stuff. So let's go for the next one. So one from Rachel here: does it take 6 months to get your body to be able to have enough ketones to use fats as soon as you have anything but low carbs? How can you train for both? Great question. To be fair, I don't know enough about the ketogenic diet to really give you an educated answer on that, to be fair. What I will do, Rachel, is I'll make a note of this question, and I will go away and I will get you an answer on that, because I don't want to give you a lot of old bluff and bluster around this, because I don't know enough in relation to how that would affect in that specific question. So bear with me, Rachel, I will come back to you on that one. So next question. So one from Charlie. What are your thoughts on fasted runs for training, and up to what time or rough distance? So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think we do need to have some fasted runs in your training, because again, as we alluded to during this presentation, this will help with that kind of fat oxidative training that we want to do. We want to get our body to be able to utilize some of those fats and be more efficient at using it during the race. In relation to what time or rough distance, I think the key thing is I try to keep it relatively short. So I try to keep no longer than 90 minutes, because you tend to find that if we go much beyond that, you'll probably get a lot of breakdown of the body in it, and the recovery from that might take a bit longer. And typically what you'll do is you'll periodize during your training. So you might have, say, your longest run, say your mid-length run during the week, you might have popped out for 2.5 hours or something like that midweek. After that meal, after that particular run, so pre that I would have probably carb loaded up and been ready on carbs. After that, I wouldn't really replace much carbs. I'd look to be putting in more protein to get the muscle recovery. And then the next day, I'd looking for an early morning kind of run of maybe an hour or so, where the body's pretty depleted of carbohydrates, goes out there and has to run. And then once you finish that particular run, make sure you put some more carbohydrates back in your system. Does that kind of make sense? So Joe, what is the value of fasted runs, and how often, and how long would you recommend? So again, a popular question, and it's kind of like previous to the same one before. I think it's definitely worthwhile having that. I would say no more than 2 runs during your week, I think is what I would recommend, because generally, like I said, you're going to have a detrimental effect if you do too much of that. You're going to struggle to get the quality training volume, and you still need to do some work in that lactate zone. If you can get that lactate turning point to go up a little bit higher during your training phases, and that means you'll be able to go a little bit faster for the same effort. So we're kind of looking at that, so you've got to bear that in mind. Next one. Can we please have more question time? Yeah, we'd love more question time. And move on to the next one if we've got any more left. One from Ian. As a simple guide, is it best for new ultra runners to eat, drink little but often every 15-20 minutes? So yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing with ultra running, as you tend to find, is it's once you get behind, it's very difficult to play catch up. So I would rather somebody was grazing frequently during their race. So for an argument's sake, if we look at last year's Anglo-Celtic Plate 100k, we had athletes, they were eating every lap, taking something on board, some hydration and a small amount of fuel. These laps were less than 2 miles, so they were taking something on very, very frequently. So definitely worthwhile doing that, but you've got to graze, and again, you've got to bring that into your training as well. So if you're going to do that in a race, make sure you do that in your training, because you don't want to suddenly get to race day and find that actually 2 hours or 3 hours of doing that, and you can stomach no more, and you just want to be sick, or you want to sit down in a hut and find a bush and do something else. So do that in your training as well. So next question, if we've got any more. Any thoughts on the ethical success that the new CEO is pushing? I've not actually looked at the ethical success promotion from our new CEO. However, I will go away and look at that. And I think, if I'm reading this right, I think what he's looking for is he's looking for a more kind of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Spencer, he will be looking for a more, I guess, ethical approach to training, so we're not forcing athletes on the verge of bullying in some cases, and cutting corners, and we're doing it in a healthy and holistic way to try to determine success. And certainly that's how I would see what my thoughts of ethical success is. As a coach, every athlete I work with, I want them to do it in a healthy, safe and sustainable way, and not take shortcuts and look for any kind of magic pill or quick fix to get somewhere. How important is the ratio of glucose to fructose in your fuel? Great question. I don't really know. Again, the answer is Oliver on that one. I will go wait and I will get the answer to that one. Any more questions? Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for your time. We probably needed at least an extra 15 minutes on this webinar. Thanks to Spencer for letting it run for a bit longer. Huge thanks there. Again, check out our future webinars. What I may well do is we've got the 4th webinar due next Monday. I will probably do an extension of this. So we'll look at the second half of the slides we didn't cover and a quick recap of the first half. So those questions that we didn't answer tonight, we'll answer in that particular session as well. So next one is going to be an extension of this, really, basically the second half of this presentation and a quick overview of what we covered in the first half. But thanks for your time, folks. I hope you found it useful. Don't forget to check out the other webinars that England Athletics are putting on right now, and I hope to see you again on next Monday. Thanks.